Hi everyone, Demir here from Westmount Wealth Management. There's a moment that often follows success, whether it's a business sale, a meaningful deferred compensation package vesting, or maybe a windfall where work becomes optional. Your net worth finally reflects years, sometimes decades worth of effort. And then the quieter question shows up seemingly out of nowhere. Will this be enough? It's a funny thing. A couple of $1,000,000 can feel like complete security at age 45 and perhaps something far less certain at age 65. Nothing about the number has fundamentally changed, but everything about your relationship to it has. For most of your life, wealth is something that you've been building, whereas market volatility probably a bit annoying and sometimes frustrating, but temporary. Your income did the heavy lifting, but at some point that equation flips. Now the portfolio is the engine, and what used to feel like a small bump in the road starts to feel like something you really need to pay attention to. It's like hiking a mountain. On the way up, you're pushing forward, and you're mainly focused on your progress. On the way down, you're watching every single step, because one wrong move matters a lot more. It's the same mountain, ironically, but a very different mindset and a very different approach. That simple question, will this be enough, usually isn't about the number. It's about what sits underneath it. How much can I safely spend? What if inflation slowly chips away at my purchasing power? What if markets disappoint for a decade? What if our lifestyle quietly expands and doesn't come back down? Those aren't irrational fears. They're practical, real-life, pragmatic questions that, quite frankly, most people would do very well to reflect on. Inflation alone, even at 3%, cuts your purchasing power in half over 20 to 25 years. Markets can absolutely have long stretches of disappointment. We've seen entire decades lead to nowhere. Take 2000 to 2009 in US equities. And when employment income disappears, the portfolio takes on a whole new role. Naturally, it gets a lot more scrutiny. So it's important to take a step back and talk about how this anxiety tends to show up. It's rarely dramatic. It looks more like delaying decisions because now doesn't feel like the right time, or holding extra cash for comfort even as inflation eats away at it, or perhaps spending more when markets are strong, then pulling back really aggressively when they're not, assuming that you're lucky enough to have that spending flexibility. It's that uneasy shift from living off a salary to living off a finite reservoir. Suddenly, every bucket you take out feels visible, even if the reservoir is actually rather deep. The issue usually isn't the size of the portfolio, it's that the objective has actually changed, but the framework probably didn't. During accumulation, the question was, what can I earn? In retirement, the question becomes, what do I actually need to earn? That shift changes everything, because once you know what your portfolio needs to deliver, you stop chasing what it could deliver. Designing a portfolio for 7% returns when you only need 3.5% is a bit like driving 140 on a road where 80 would get you there just as fine. You might get there faster, but you're taking on a lot more risk than is necessary. This is where thoughtful, thorough planning brings structure. Instead of one big pool of money, think of your portfolio like a series of stepping stones across a river. Short-term needs are covered with stable, liquid assets. Medium-term needs are balanced for risk and return, and long-term assets are positioned for long-term growth. Now, you're not trying to leap across the river in one jump, you're walking across it step by step. That structure does something very powerful. It reduces the chances that you're forced to make decisions at the worst possible time, because sequence risk is real. If markets struggle early on in your retirement, the impact can be very long-lasting, even if long-term averages look fine on paper. But when near-term spending is already accounted for, volatility becomes easier to live with and much less likely to drive reactive decisions. Perhaps during your working years, risk often felt like, or was spoken about, like a personality trait, conservative or aggressive, but in retirement, risk becomes practical. How much volatility can your plan absorb without breaking? Markets will fluctuate. That's not a possibility, it's actually a guarantee. The real risk isn't volatility, it's being forced to react to it at the wrong time. That's where planning changes the conversation. Instead of wondering what if, you can actually see how your plan holds up under different scenarios. The problem is that when every withdrawal feels like removing a brick from a wall, hesitation is pretty natural, but a well-structured plan reframes that. Spending becomes part of the design, it's not a threat to it. And the feeling of enough doesn't come from hitting a specific number. It comes from alignment. Alignment between what you have and what you need, between your assets and your obligations and your long-term liabilities, between the risk you're taking and the return you actually require. At Westmount Wealth Management, that's where we focus. We bring structure to what often feels uncertain, not to eliminate uncertainty entirely, because quite frankly, that's impossible, but to make sure you're not exposed to it blindly. Because large sums of money can still feel very fragile, to be quite frank, until they're anchored in a plan that's designed to support your life, adapt over time, and hold steady when markets and emotions inevitably test it. Thanks again for watching, and as always, if you have questions, you know where to find us.